And so to finish up then with Gebser, with Chapter 8, The Foundations of the Aperspectival World, if Gebser had stopped Volume 1 here with Chapter 7, then he would have confined himself to the sevenfold spheres of the cavern night sky. So it's a significant fact, I think, that he has an 8th chapter. In German, the word Achtung means attention, but it also has the number 8 in there, Acht, the number 8, because the 8th is associated with the shifting out of the sevenfold planetary nighttime sky into the domain of wakefulness. And so, Gebser's concluding insights in this chapter are to basically say that there is, anywhere we look throughout history, we can see this process of the awakening of consciousness. And various different specialists may disagree with Gebser, because after all, specialists only get single cross sections. They only get one section of their point of view of reality, and they don't see the whole picture. This kind of integralist thinking is something that they're allergic to. But I think that wherever we look through history, this process of awakening can be seen. There's tons of evidence for it. This movement from the lunar to the solar, from the cults of the nighttime sky to the cults of the daytime, is an established fact wherever we look. Lunar calendars are older than solar calendars. The solar calendar that was invented by the Egyptians did not come into play in the West until Julius Caesar adopted it and put into place the Julian calendar. Then the solar calendar became standard for the West after that point. But the Egyptians themselves, the discovery of the shift from the lunar to the solar, was also a gradual process. If we look at the layout in the first couple of dynasties of the Old Kingdom, especially the layout in the third dynasty, the Great Pyramid Complex, the first pyramid of the pharaoh Zoser, as I've remarked elsewhere, is laid out on a huge north-south axis, and the north entrance to the pyramid, which isn't an entrance, actually it's an egress for the Ka of the pharaoh to go up to the pole star to join the whirling, twittering stars that circle around the pole star, which never sets below the horizon and is therefore deathless. Unlike Orion, which sets and rises every 72 days and that was therefore linked with Osiris, the dying and reviving god. But these early cults, with the bull imagery, everywhere you look, you see the throne laid out in the shape of the bull. The bull is linked with the moon and the nighttime sky. Gradually gives way to, in the fourth dynasty, the pyramid complex shifts from a north-south and hence nighttime orientation to an east-west, a square shape, that is oriented on an east-west axis. The mortuary temple is moved from the north face where it had been on the Zoser complex to the east face where it can greet the rising sun, and there we have a shift to the solar. Along with the rise of the cult of Re, we begin to see in the names of the pharaohs of the fourth dynasty, Kaf Re and Menkau Re, we begin to see the Re and the solar cults, and then in the fifth dynasty, the rise of the great sun temples. So there is a gradual process there of awakening of consciousness, a movement from the Shtonic cults of the nighttime, the cavern of the nighttime sky, to the solar world. You can see the same shift in India, from the Mahabharata to the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is the older text, in my opinion. Some scholars think the Ramayana is older, but in my opinion the Mahabharata is older because it's situated in northwest India, at Hastinapura, which is an old city along the Ganges there in northwest India, whereas in later Indian civilization the culture shifts down to the south, and the Ramayana is of course set in the south. Well, it's set at Ayodhya, but it takes place, they have to go to Sri Lanka to get the girl back. So it has a southern emphasis and I think comes later, and the Ramayana is a great solar epic. The Rama is descended from the sun, whereas the Mahabharata, all the kings are descended from the lunar dynasties. So the Mahabharata, in my opinion, is the older text. We have the lunar, then the solar with the Ramayana. In China, we can see something similar there. We have the Xia dynasty, Xia, the Xia dynasty, which is supposed to be older than the Shang dynasty, and which may actually be linked with the archaeological finds of the so-called Early Do culture, which date from about 2000 to 1700 BC. The Xia dynasty was supposedly a lunar dynasty, whereas the Shang dynasty, which was later, was a solar dynasty. There's the movement once again from the lunar to the solar, and so on. And Gebser, I notice in his charts here in on page 270 of chapter 8 here, has a list for the body parts where the soul has been localized throughout history. And he says that the earliest organs for the localization of the soul were originally in the magic consciousness structure, semen on the one hand and blood on the other. I presume by blood, he means blood in a lot of different senses, but also we have to consider the fact that menstrual blood, as William Irving Thompson pointed out, is associated with burials. If we look back in history at the earliest burials, and the earliest one that we know of now dates to about 100,000 BC in Israel at a place called Gebser Cave, where we find the burial of a woman known as Q9. She is laid out with an infant at her feet, and the entire body is stained with red ochre. And from that point on, red ochre becomes something that is associated with the dead, that is sprinkled on the dead. The Neanderthals didn't use it, but this is a Proto-Cro-Magnon grave. And they used it, and it gets used all the way down to about 4000 BC in Mesopotamia, where it shifts. I noticed that there are some grave burials that archaeologists found that date from Mesopotamia somewhere around about 4000 BC, in which the dead are buried with a blue dye, which can't be explained in any other way except, I think, by reference to the blue of the daytime sky. Lapis lazuli was the substance that was associated with the power of the daytime sky. In Egypt, it was turquoise, which was associated with Hathor, the cow goddess, who was also the goddess of the daytime sky, whereas Nut was the goddess of the nighttime sky. And I think the shift in the use of red ochre to this blue dye that appears for the first time in the grave burials in Mesopotamia is a shift, again, from the nighttime sky to the daytime, in so far as the red ochre is linked with the menstrual blood, since there was a theory, and you can still find this theory in Aristotle, that the reason the woman stops menstruating at the time of pregnancy is because she's using that blood now to build the embryo, to construct the embryo in her womb. So the idea was that if you sprinkle the red ochre that symbolizes the menstrual blood on the body, it will magically rebuild a new subtle body for the dead person. That seems to be the logic here for red ochre, and is therefore connected with the menstrual cycle, and the menstrual cycle is connected with the moon. So we have the dark world of the nighttime sky, to which the dead immemorially, the dead, I think, were connected with the sky and the nighttime vault much earlier and much more primordially than with the idea of an underworld beneath the earth. And so we have the localization of the soul in the magical consciousness structure in semen and blood, but we also have in the mythical, it shifts up to, from the genitals, it shifts up to the heart. The soul becomes localized in the heart. In ancient Egypt, the heart was, of course, the only organ left in the body. All the other organs were taken out of the body because the dead person would need the heart in the afterlife, because it is put on the scales and weighed against the feather of truth of the goddess Maat, that determines whether the individual will have a happy destiny in the afterlife or one in which he simply wanders through its labyrinth, bewildered and confronted by all these demons and so forth. For the Greeks as well, as for Homer, the heart is the center of consciousness. All through Greek and Hellenistic civilization, it's centered in the heart. And then later, of course, with the mental consciousness structure, it moves up the spinal column into the brain, and the brain, with Descartes, I think, therefore I am, becomes the seat and center of consciousness. I think that Descartes localized, as I recall, the soul in the pineal gland, which is an interesting reversal of the fact that for, Gebser says that for mythical man, the eyes are blind. Homer is blind and Tiresias is blind, because they see with the inner eye, just as Shiva has the third eye, which is the eye of inner vision that sees the subtle matter, the self-luminous forms of the dreaming consciousness that come up and bubble up from within. And whereas he says the integral consciousness is not a consciousness bound to the eye at all. The mythical has to do with the inner eye, the eye in the middle of the forehead. The mental has to do with the outer eye that is outer directed into things spread out into space, whereas the integral consciousness is not bound to the eye at all in quite the same way. Now, Gebser doesn't say this, but if anyone who's read McLuhan knows that his shift from the Gutenbergian galaxy, which is indeed a world like Gebser's mythical that's nailed down by the eye. The typographic man represents the stepping up of the sense of vision at the expense of all the other senses, so that you get the most abstract kind of consciousness ever in history, is in the 19th century stepped down. The sense of vision is stepped down with the shift into the electrical acoustic phase space. With electricity now, Starting with the telegraph, information begins beaming at us from all directions of the globe simultaneously in exactly the way that sound comes to us and forms an acoustic 360-degree cavern all around us. So we get this bombardment, this information overload, which begins to configure an acoustical phase space. And in the acoustical phase space is governed not only by the sense of sound, but also by the sense of touch, and touch is discontinuous, not continuous. The visual space of perspectival Gutenbergian man is a continuous space because it's held together by the eye, which situates objects inside of a continuous space. The sense of touch is discontinuous, as anyone who reads Braille knows, obviously. It's discontinuous. To the blind man, all things are sudden. So I think that though Gebser does not associate the acoustic with the integral consciousness structure, I think that we can supplement this idea that it does retrieve the acoustic. In a sense, he has the integral retrieving the archaic. It's a return to the archaic ground of ever-present origin, except now with the knowledge of the intervening consciousness structures. But I think it also retrieves the acoustic space of magical man, and this is basically what McLuhan said in his insights, that the electric retrieves tribal man, brings him back. We are undergoing in reverse Havelock's detribalization process in reverse, moving from the individual back into the tribal process, so that all the Finns are indeed again awakening upon the planet exactly as James Joyce said in Finnegan's Wake. He saw that we would be shifting back into tribalization, and the global village is not a happy little metaphor that means we're all united and bound in the same happy little village. It's an image of a resurgence of a tribal dark ages in which we have oystery gods, gag and vishy gods, fishy gods, at war with one another. So we have, in Joyce's epic, as McLuhan saw, a prescient foreshadowing of the coming Dark Age and the devolution of culture into all these warring tribes going against each other. Gebser doesn't address this, and for me, this failure to see, and I think Spangler did see this, as well as McLuhan, this failure to see this decline into a retribalized Dark Ages does not occur in Gebser's integral consciousness structure, which for me, as we stand here on the threshold between Volume 1 and 2, may be one of his failings, and it may turn out to be the case that the integral consciousness structure really is only a way of holding together modernist art, modernist culture, modernist science, and seeing it as a big, giant, elite sphere that holds all of modernism together, but that really fails to have any kind of applicability once you get into postmodernism and the world of popular culture and the pop landscape, which doesn't seem to fit quite so well, I think, with the integral consciousness structure. In the popular landscape, we begin to get the rise of the mythical and the magical and retribalized man, and McLuhan's acoustic electric world in a way that's much more realistic, I think, than Gebser's idea of this integral consciousness structure that takes us on up into the omega point of history, as it were. I mean, he didn't intend it in that way, but it more or less amounts to that, I think, a final end point at the end of history, a consciousness sphere that takes up only the elite, only the highbrow culture, and overlooks the preterites, those who have been overlooked by the grace of God, the underprivileged, those who are not part of the elitism of highbrow Euro-modernist culture are left out, and consequently this is reflected in Gebser's attitude toward popular culture, which is disparaging and dismissive. So I think there may be some limitations on Gebser's insight, and I think he may be simply coming up with a metaphor that unifies and makes sense out of modernism in a way that Spangler couldn't do, but that fails to have any applicability after we move out of the epoch of modernism into postmodernity and the rise of pop culture, where his integral consciousness no longer really fits quite so easily, I think. But we'll know more about this, and I'll see more about this as we move through Part 2, Manifestations of the Aperspectival World, in which the entirety of Part 2 is concerned with a sort of archaeology of exclusively the integral consciousness structure.